to our afternoon session. We're so excited to have you back. Hope everybody had a chance to get outside or check some emails or do whatever you needed to do personally to set the stage for this afternoon's learning. We have the opportunity this afternoon to engage in another great session. And I have the opportunity to introduce Starla, who will be talking about curriculum, instruction, and assessment and framing our work for this year. So I hope everybody's ready. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Starla.
Great, thank you, Jenny. And in addition to checking emails, I hope you also had a chance to eat lunch. So hopefully you got that in there as well. So great to be back again this afternoon with you, start the day with you, start the afternoon with you. What a joy for me. We may not take the whole time, and I'll turn it over to our ICs maybe just a little bit earlier than the agenda allows, but you know what, I don't think it's ever broken a heart to end something a little bit early. So I'll use just the time I need. And so Starla Pearson, Executive Director of Curriculum and Instruction, and proud to do that work. And my job is to accelerate the learning of every APS student every day. I do my job by leading a team of professionals who make certain that our leaders and our teachers have the skills and resources that they need to make sure that our students can shape a successful future. My community needs me to do my job. And I start with a poem this afternoon. Poetry speaks to me, as I know that it does to so many of you as well. And it really resonates with even the road that Rika was talking about this morning. As she closed the book of her old life, sighing relief as she finally let go, she carved a path to a new beginning, writing a new chapter. The uneasy feeling of change soon faded away, and for the first time in a while, her soul felt free. And I know that this can speak to people in a lot of different ways. To me, this really lets us look toward a new beginning, lets us look toward a new year after, and you know, again, so many unknowns, but after a year of a lot of unknowns, after a year of global pandemic that created so much havoc in what we know schooling to be. And so just really excited to look forward to just to a new school year. Next slide. I really want to talk about how the district at our level is really trying to create the coherence that Jenny has talked about, that Christy talked about, because the more we can connect things and the more we can create a coherent plan, the more likely you are to see those connections and to see that coherence at the building level. So I draw you back to the instructional infrastructure. I also remind you of what Jenny referred to earlier this morning, that we're not trying to roll a lot of new things out. It doesn't make sense to do that. What it really makes sense to do is to get better at the things that we've been working on. And so the instructional infrastructure should look familiar to you. And of course, this is a visual framework or a conceptual framework that comes to us from the University of Virginia. The University of Virginia, of course, just puts together a frame. It's up to us to make it Aurora Public Schools frame. And that's exactly what we did 4 years ago. We took one of those. So if you look at UVA's work, there's actually 4 big buckets, and the instructional infrastructure is one of them. And so the instructional infrastructure is represented with this graphic, that if you put together your curriculum components, an assessment strategy, the data systems and structures, and collaboration structures, then those things come together to create conditions for quality instruction. And so 4 years ago, we really worked on a team to put together the APS version of the instructional infrastructure. We had iterative process where we had some school leaders looking at that. We would recreate, we would have more feedback, we would recreate. And so the instructional infrastructure in each of the components came forward then 4 years ago to you with some tight and flexible aspects. And so the tight and flexible creates continuity and coherence across the system. So that we are saying that no matter what school you go to in Aurora Public Schools, students, you will have these kinds of experiences in terms of how you are taught and what you're taught. And so in curriculum components, some of the actions that we've taken over the last 4 years is we've updated some resources in literacy and math, in science, and this year, of course, in high school literacy and social studies. And when we update the curricular resources, I always want to remind people that that's more than just the book or more than just the online resource. That's everything that goes with it. It's all of the connections to standards. So anytime we're talking about a curricular resource, we're also talking about all of the standards maps and the vertical alignment maps and the scope and sequence maps that go along with the resource itself. In terms of our assessment strategy over the last 4 years, we have adopted as a full system Illuminate as the platform to hold our assessments. So that's where we see our iReady diagnostics. That's where we see iReady interims. That's where we see our common formative assessments, is having a common platform. If you recall, before Illuminate, there were choices that people had, which is autonomy around selecting an assessment might make great sense until you're trying to bring it together as a full system. And then we had some people who were using Acuity and some people who were using maps and some people who were using iReady and some other kinds of resources. And so then you're never able to bring together a coherent assessment system if everything is so disparate. The data systems and structures, the actions that we've taken in the last 4 years to really support that work, one has been the most important work, has been the assessment calendar. And that's starting with even the Board of Education who approved, and the District Calendar Committee, but the Board of Education who finally makes the approval of 3 data-driven instruction days. And so for the last 2 years, going into now our 3rd year, we've had our DDI days. And so this is really unprecedented. It truly is. When you look across our country, to see a district the size of Aurora Public Schools finding a way and making some mechanisms to bring teachers together from across the system with some common understandings, common language, common assessments, and to have to really blow out that PLC structure that you all see in your buildings that works so effectively, and broadening it across an entire system. And so the assessment calendar and the approval of our data-driven instruction days followed with all of the planning that went into that to make those DDI days happen, and the planning that will continue to make those DDI days happen is all part of the data systems and structures. And the collaboration structure, of course, the DDI structure itself, and building level PLCs really support the collaboration structures. It's something we continue to want to improve, is to help support buildings around developing and supporting and growing professional learning communities, because it is such a powerful tool to improve instruction. Surrounding the instructional infrastructure is professional development, and that is something we have also been very intentional about, is really aligning our professional development both for teachers and for leaders directly connected to the work of the instructional infrastructure. And finally, observation, feedback, and coaching. We have created some mechanisms with the in-building teaching partners as an instructional coach, having a district-wide coaching model. And so many of you have heard me say before, it's one thing to tell someone, go forth and coach. It's another to really make sure that they have the tools to do so. And so that's what our district-wide approach has been, is to really help develop our instructional coaches through our teaching partners in that way. Next slide. And so I bring us back to what Christy was talking about earlier today in terms of how these pieces fit together. And so again, the more we can make that happen at the district level, the more we can align at the district level, the better it is for you to be able to align that work at the building level. And so you can see that the APS Board of Education priorities around improving those experiences for our third grade readers, improving those experiences for our students of color at 6th grade and 9th grade, to close those gaps and increase the opportunity for grade level learning and expectations is what drives all of our work. And so you'll see that same language showing up in our strategic plan. In the strategic plan, as Christy pointed out this morning in Goal 2, we have focused on academic skills for a number of years through the strategic plan. And now we've also incorporated and broadened that to be thinking about social and emotional skills. One of the work streams that Jessica Omeraday's team and the curriculum and instruction team will be engaging in is revisiting the standards maps and finding ways in that tier 1 space to incorporate social emotional learning where it fits best in general instruction. And so that'll be part of our work throughout the course of this year. Jessica's team has done an outstanding job of really addressing some tier 2 and tier 3 needs in buildings around social emotional learning. And this process will allow us to look at tier 1 in that more embedded sort of way. That leads to then, through the work of the instructional infrastructure, ought to lead to the UIP development and at the building level, and also weaves right into your 90-day plan. So all of those things connected one to the other. Last year, the curriculum and instruction team focused on, if you think back to the UVA rubric around implementation and execution, the curriculum and instruction team focused on the design elements. So if you think about that rubric, it takes you through from foundational to, somebody might need to help me out here, is it core, foundational, and deep execution? And so if you look at that rubric, it's the district's job to design to deep execution, and it's the building's job to implement to deep execution. But if as a district we haven't designed to deep execution, then it makes it much harder for you to implement to deep execution. So the curriculum instruction team really took those pertinent aspects of the UVA rubric and really moved our work towards that deep execution to better support your work around being able to implement in the deeper execution area as well. Next slide, please. And again, all of these pieces, when they fit together, create the conditions for quality instruction. And Jenny, if you take us to our next slide, this takes us back to our compelling why. And this is the working definition in Aurora Public Schools around equity. Now, again, as has been alluded to or spoken to with Rico and with Christy, we will have some continued work around equity, some continued focus around that. But this definition continues to just ring so importantly true for our students. And so defined as a set of practices where the acceleration of student learning is not predictable based on a student's race, ethnicity, class, background, or prior experience, but is determined by the actions that we take to ensure success for every student. We understand that students have different strengths and needs, and that equitable treatment of students requires different actions. And more specifically related to curriculum and instruction, if you'll take us to the next slide, this is an adaptation of of some of the language out of Unbound Ed that speaks specifically to equity through curriculum and instruction. And that statement is that we believe that educational equity ensures that all children, regardless of circumstances, are receiving high quality, grade level, and standards aligned instruction with access to high quality materials and resources. And so I want you to know that the curriculum and instruction team and everyone who serves on that is committed to this. We're committed to selecting those kinds of materials. We're committed to supporting those kinds of instructional practices. We're committed to examining our own assessment practices to make sure that, that we are really giving this kind of experience to our kids, that they are receiving that high quality, grade level, standards-based, standards-aligned instruction. Take me to the next slide. This may also look familiar. This comes from Pedro Nagarro's work, and our superintendent has leaned on these 10 ways to pursue excellence through equity multiple times. And again, this continues to influence our work and impact our work. And we may see some shifts around this or some nuances at least as our district continues in their equity work. But I really want to point out some of the aspects of this frame or some of these 10 ways to pursue excellence through equity through just the work we're doing today and over the next few days in Lead and Learn. And so please pay particular attention to implement evidence-based practices and evaluate for effectiveness. So as we think about some of the things that we continue to roll out as new resources for people, for our teachers to use, for our students to interact with, think about the implementation of those evidence-based practices and our commitment to evaluating that through survey, through observation, to make sure that what we are putting in front of our students is really hitting that mark. The other thing I would ask you to focus on with these 10 ways to pursue is to rethink remediation and focus on acceleration. And you will most definitely hear much more about that this afternoon with our focus on the acceleration plan. I know that many of our building leaders, you have been working on this as well, and just really thinking about how we can help our students hit the ground running in a different way this year. And so instead of thinking about the lens of remediation, which needs to happen from time to time, really thinking about how do we really move kids ahead? How do we really accelerate our students so that we're meeting those assurances in our resiliency and recovery plan that we've promised our students and promised our community? All of this ties together with resiliency and recovery as a plan to help students gain that academic and social and emotional strength. Next slide. So this year, what's new in curriculum and instruction? And so we had a robust year-long process to review, select, adopt, and procure, and provide professional development around some new resources. And so, we'll be seeing new high school literacy, new high school social studies, new middle school science, and new elementary science resources. All of these are aligned with Colorado academic standards. Some of these had not been renewed in a number of years. I'm thinking, if my memory serves me right, we were back in the 1990s. I want to say it was like 1997 was the last time we had really approved anything for high school literacy. And as you can imagine, standards shifted multiple times in that time frame. So all of these are aligned with the shifts in standards, and particularly science, where the state adopted those standards now a year ago, a full year ago. And so now our resources are aligned with those shifts in the standards as well. And what's ahead in curriculum and instruction? Looks like a long list, so bear with me. I'll go through quickly. One of the processes we'll be conducting this year is middle school ELD resources and scope and sequence. The CLDE team 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and 2 years ago phased in EL Achieve in our elementary spaces to really shore up our English language development practices and support. And so now Ashley Sadler and the CLDE team is really working to make sure that our middle school ELD classes have same kind of robust sort of resources. Elementary and middle school social studies resource process will be put into play. And so whereas, and that's part of just our general rotation. It has been a solid 8 years and probably a little bit more, even in elementary, since we've really examined our social studies resources for our elementary and middle school spaces. So we'll be going through that process this year. Of course, high school graduation requirements shift and go into play this year. We've had a high school graduation task force for the last couple of years who's really done the hard work of making sure that the ability to earn credits and choose from this menu of options is in place for our kids. And so hats off to that team and hats off to our high school staff who are really working to make this happen for our kids. The K-3 reading designation was a legislative decision made that all K-3 reading teachers must have a designation that they have met a requirement for reading coursework that has been approved by CDE. We do have a READ Act coordinator. This job has really gotten so big in terms of not only what we report to the state, but also how we monitor our own, not only licensing around that, but more importantly, our own reading practices. And so Jackie Kurz is serving in that role. APS Keys to Literacy is one of the ways that teachers can meet that designation. The first reading of the language was that by January 31st, all of our K-3 reading teachers and anyone who is support staff who teaches reading must meet that state designation. They have now moved that to the end of the school year, but we are really pushing to make sure that by January 31st, our teachers have met that requirement. From a district perspective, that has an impact on READ funds. From a personal perspective, it has an impact on whether a teacher can continue to teach or not. If they haven't met that designation, then they can no longer teach it in that content at that grade level. And so it could mean that a teacher may, under some circumstances, not be able to keep their job. So we need to make sure we're doing everything we can do to support our teachers to meet that requirement. We're also working to improve Tier 1 instruction. One of the things I mentioned before was the social emotional learning work that Jessica Meriday's team and our team will do to really align that with the standards map. What I'm really excited about is to share with you about the Literacy Lab project. This is going to be a 2-year project with PEBC, the Public Education Business Coalition. So we're partnering with PEBC for 2 years and I could talk about this all day because I'm so excited about it, but it's really going to be a phased-in approach to select some lab hosts in K through 3 reading. So the best way I can paint a picture around that is instead of us thinking about going into classrooms, whether that's a principal alongside our team, learning community directors, coaches, whomever, instead of going into classrooms to see if we can find where these really solid practices are happening, we're going to develop these lab hosts at a kindergarten reading classroom, a first grade, a second grade, a third grade, across the communities that we have worked to develop these lab hosts, coached these lab hosts, so that we have a way to see what solid reading instruction and literacy instruction looks like. We can use this for teachers to view, whether that's in person or virtually. We as a system will be able to view this in person or virtually. And so it's really building up professional development through the classroom level, building up that capacity of our teachers to really serve as exemplar practices. And the second part of that is to then build up our own APS capacity to build lab classrooms. So while we'll be working with PEBC to do this in the literacy space, our own team will be learning how to build up lab classrooms in all content areas and all grade levels. So it makes it much more widespread, much more ubiquitous, and it just gives us a way to really elevate strong instructional practices here at home in Aurora Public Schools. So more to come on that, but that gives you at least a general overview of the Literacy Lab project. One thing that we'll be doing this year, the instructional infrastructure, it's time to revisit that. It was 4 years ago, it was designed, developed, and rolled out for implementation. And now it's time to come back and revisit. Let's take a look at the tight and the flexible. Did we get that right? Are we still holding the right things tight? Are we still naming the right flexibilities? And so we'll have a process that will seek your input as well to really go back and revisit the instructional infrastructure. And then two other things, just as a reminder, August 10th is our district professional learning day. And there, as Jen mentioned earlier, there'll be more information coming on that. And then starting the rest of this afternoon, we'll start leaning into the whole notion of accelerating learning for every APS student every day. So glad to be with you. So glad to be here as a learner with you. And with that, I haven't been checking chat, or let me just do a quick check there to see. Okay, so no questions. A couple of agreements on PEBC, glad to see that as well, and really excited to share more about that as we roll that out. So with that, I thank you for your time, your attention, your energy, your leadership, your heart for kids, and I will turn this over now to Shelley DeGuaro.
Thank you, Starla.
Thank you so much, Starla. And Jenny, yeah, thank you. And Emily is going to share her screen when we get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Shelley DeGuaro, Elementary Literacy Instructional Coordinator, and we are very excited to be with you this afternoon, as Starla mentioned and has been discussed, to really get us into more of our APS acceleration framework with some more specifics. Next slide, I want to first highlight who will be facilitating our session this afternoon. You will meet the rest of the instructional coordinator team as we go through this afternoon, but I do want to take a minute and introduce one of our newest team members. As many of you may know, Amanda Gould is now part of Team Yale, and we are very excited for her and for Yale, and know that she's going to do amazing things to serve the Yale community. And many of you already know Emily Lavery, who has been working alongside Amanda really for many years in the work and supporting her as being the main person supporting K-12 social studies, which is a heavy lift. So Emily comes to us with already many years of experience in supporting this work, and we are excited for her to join our team. So I'll let her just give a quick hi and say hello.
Hello, thank you, everybody. I'm excited to serve you.
Alongside us in a collaborative effort to finalize the acceleration framework, we are excited to have a few people with us today to co-facilitate. Jessica Omirade from Mental Health and Counseling, Jen McCammon, ESS Program Director, and CLDE Director Ashley Sadler. And they are going to support us as well in making connections in each context to discuss what it looks like to provide accelerated learning for all of our students. And with that, we'll get started with some objectives. Just give you a second to glance over these objectives and explain a little bit more about what we're going to dig into today during our session. Throughout your time this morning, we know that you've had some time to dig into some of the objectives that are listed first. And we are now going to explore the acceleration framework as a tool to share with you so that we can all calibrate our understandings and make some school level connections to the work that you are doing. And so with that, I will hand it over to Sam Duvey.
Thanks, Shelley. So we're going to ground ourselves in the purpose behind the acceleration framework. And so when we created the acceleration framework, we considered the purpose from the district assurances, which is you all learned about this morning, and then the research from the new teacher project. The acceleration framework was developed with the commitment that every student should have access to grade appropriate assignments, strong instruction, deep engagement, and a sense of belonging, and teachers with high expectations for their every day in every class, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or any other part of their identity. And the goal that all students will have meaningful, enriching classroom experiences that set them up academically, socially, and emotionally to reach the goals they have for themselves. Next slide, please. So in this visual, you can see how all the different elements weave together to work together to ensure learning acceleration for all students every day. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beth.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Beth Joswick. I'm our elementary math instructional coordinator. We want to take just a few minutes to reground in some reading and then get a quick glimpse into our acceleration framework. So we know that you've been doing a lot of work to create your own recovery and resiliency plans. And we also know this is not the first time you've heard the word acceleration. But we do want to take a moment to reground in this excerpt from Learning in the Fast Lane. If you have your books with you, it's pages 6 through 9. It's also linked in the agenda, those pages. And allow you to explore the acceleration framework that was created in collaboration with the teams that were identified above. So we ask that you make connections to what you are currently seeing in your building and identify any questions you have. We're going to start with 10 minutes to read that excerpt from Learning in the Fast Lane and then also explore the acceleration framework. We know 10 minutes is not a lot of time to go incredibly deep, but we would like you to get just familiar with the a little bit of the content and the format of the acceleration framework. And then we're going to push you into breakout rooms to have a discussion and make connections to the work that you are already doing within your buildings. So we're going to take 10 minutes right now of private reasoning time to take a look at that excerpt and then to also dive into the acceleration framework. And at 1:30, we'll be pushing into breakout rooms for a quick discussion. So we know that was a quick view of regrounding in that reading and then taking a peek at the acceleration framework. And at this time, we want to allow you an opportunity for initial thoughts with your colleagues. So Jenny, if you could push into breakout rooms for 10 minutes.
All right, thanks everybody for coming back and engaging in that reading and discussion with your group. So we wanted to just kind of give you an opportunity to focus on that inquiry question, do some exploration yourself, elicit some connections and ideas. I heard some really great stuff in my group around, Vista Peak's already really focusing on prior knowledge this year in order to accelerate reading comprehension, and that the connection there was really clear. So I just appreciated those conversations. So we wanted to, after you had a chance to make your own connections, kind of explain a little bit where we built this framework from. So what we did was we were looking at the priorities for equitable instruction that Achieve the Core put out a while back. And those 5 priorities are human-centered learning, academic acceleration, culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy, understanding student progress, and integrated scaffolds and supports. So our portion of this as an instructional coordinator team when we were building this out was really to focus on academic acceleration. We had the support of Jessica Omerday and her team, Ashley and Piper, their team, Jen McCammon and her team, to help us think through lenses, different lenses than we have our expertise in. So this was a really collaborative process in building this, and you're going to hear from all of those teams here in just a moment. So when we as an IC team focused in on the academic acceleration piece, we got those 6 tenets of acceleration from Learning in the Fast Lane, from the excerpt you just read or you have read previously, in order to build out this framework and provide examples and thinking around how we might go about acceleration. One thing I heard in my group is that, some of this stuff is like, that's just best practice, and we kind of know a lot of this already. We talked about a little bit about the knowing and doing gap, right? So how is a laser focus on these tenets going to help us close that knowing and doing gap? So this is where our framework came from. We're going to have an opportunity to dig more into content specific aspects of this framework. But before we do that, we are going to let our other teams that supported us in building this share. So Jessica Meredith, I believe I'm handing it off to you at this point.
All right, yes, thank you. I'm very excited also in the collaboration. It was a lot of fun to be able to work with the IC team. In the Department of Mental Health and Counseling, when we're talking about social emotional learning at this point, coming back from the pandemic, we're not talking as much about the development of new social emotional learning skills or content. We're really talking about how do we provide a regulating environment and weave some of those concepts into academic core content and pedagogical decisions. So I do want to try to reduce any anxiety that might be out there about adding additional content. We're really looking at how to support a regulating environment for students coming back from the pandemic. The best research out there is from the Child Trauma Academy, all other trauma-informed practices, and those that look at chronic stress, they pull their information from Bruce Perry's work. So we're looking today at the 6 R's or key elements of positive development in the educational setting. So using these 6 R's, and there are a lot of you who probably already heard this as well, or pilot schools in using some of this. So hopefully you're excited to see how this is getting embedded and woven into the acceleration framework. These are the 6 R's. So when we implement these, we implement them for a regulated classroom for acceleration. So the reason we do it is because a regulated student and a regulated staff member go further faster. The first R is relevant, which means that it's developmentally matched. And you know what, before I go any further, I'm going to put a handout into the chat that just kind of summarizes some of this for you in case you want it or want to look at it. But relevant is being aware of the developmental levels of the kids that are in front of you so that you can offer appropriate content, which is grade level content. So we're still not talking about remediation when we talk about that, in a way that can be understood. So that is all the amazing ways that we already scaffold, right? So this is kind of calling attention to that and just being strategic about where students might be functioning. So there's some questions in the handout that you can ask your teachers when you're thinking about relevant. So what amount of information can be tolerated before a small group is needed, or 10 minutes of reflection time is needed on the content that you're working on. How is information chunked? How is content presented? Who do students work with? How can information be presented in the learning environment are all ways to ensure relevance. Rhythmic. So our brains are rhythmic organs. When we look and learn rhythmically, we learn faster and go further faster. There's a lot of different ways to include rhythm into a classroom. The rhythm in the voice you use and the tone of voice you use when you're providing instruction, even the rhythm of how lessons are delivered, even the rhythm of knowing that you have a launch and then you have the bulk of the instruction and then you have how you're going to sum that up, that's rhythm. So when you're doing that, you're utilizing rhythm in the classroom. There's also ways to use rhythm during short breaks to help refocus and regulate students. You can do that as a whole group where you have specific time set aside to take breaks, or you can have calming corners where an individual student may need more rhythmic activities to regulate, and that's where they can go and do it and rejoin class right away. So there's also ways to use your content rhythmically to help re-regulate a student as well. These do not have to be long, 1 minute, 3 minutes. They don't have to be long, but strategically placed, that is regulating. So then we also have repetitive. So this is patterned. Repetitive pairs really nice with rhythmic, but making sure that we have creatively as possible offered content in multiple ways over the course of a lesson or over the course of the year. So we also have relational, and this makes kids feel safe. And here's the deal, relationships can be built really quickly. We're talking about milliseconds. So the way that eye contact is made, the way that we use a person's name, the tone of voice we use, the place we put our body when we're talking to somebody, all of that is relational. How we incorporate background knowledge based on what a student already knows, their history, their culture, that is relational and makes an environment safe for regulation. Rewarding is all about that self-efficacy place, setting a student up for success, then they're ready, just like in the reading, then they're ready for the content and are successful. That's rewarding, pleasurable. The types of activities you do that are fun and engaging are rewarding. And then respectful is really about knowing the individual kid and where they come from and who they are and incorporating that into the academic learning environment. So those are the 6 R's. So what you want to do now is take that acceleration framework and look at academically and educationally, where do the 6 R's fit into the acceleration framework? So if we can go back into breakout groups for 10 minutes and just go ahead and take a look at utilizing the 6 R's and seeing where that already fits in the acceleration framework.
And Sam just dropped a
All right, I think everybody's back. Hopefully you all got to see some of what we got to see in our small group, and that's how much is already happening, how much of this is already done in the academic environment, and the ability to draw attention to the social, emotional learning, and mental wellness benefits of it so that we're embedding our strategic selection of different pedagogical decisions that we're making to support social, emotional learning and mental wellness, and really trying to incorporate in some of those short refocus breaks to help the brain stay regulated and on task for acceleration. So thank you very much. And I think I'm handing it off to Jen McCammon's team.
Yes, I am Jen McCammon. I am one of the ESS program directors. And I just want to take a couple of minutes to think about accelerations and students with disabilities. When we first saw some of the work of the IC team and the acceleration framework as they were drafting it, we were super excited. I was especially because it links a lot to the work that we want to do in ESS and how we want to focus on that acceleration versus just the remediation. And when we think about how we're going to support our students with disabilities, we're going to think through what that looks like inside the general ed classroom and then outside the general ed classroom as well, and weaving in that intentional collaboration that needs to occur in order to truly accelerate students versus just that remediation piece. Thinking about inside the general education classroom, really focusing on how our students with disabilities provided their accommodations and modifications that are listed in their IEPs to promote that independence and active engagement in grade level content. So not just sitting in the classroom, not engaged, but how are we really focusing on their independence, bringing in accommodations, assistive technology, all the components we got so good at this past year with online learning to make sure that they're truly actively engaged in that standard grade level work, whether it's a student that we typically see in a center-based program or a student that we serve through mild mod. When we're thinking outside the classroom, how are we creating those links? So often I hear from principals or I go out and visit in classrooms and we see more of that remediation, that unfinished learning, but we're not making those intentional connections to the grade level standards, that opportunity to generalize to authentic reading, writing, and math. So how are we making sure we're focused on that acceleration, whether the student's inside or outside that classroom? In order for that to occur is that intentional collaboration piece. So making sure that we have systems and structures in place for our special ed teachers and providers and general ed teachers to plan for those accommodations, modifications, and that generalization piece. And that is true for our students that are working on grade level standards and our students that may be in a center-based program for part of their day, but in a general ed classroom for the other part. So how are we building in those opportunities to generalize? Along with that, and now we can move slides, is that link. The acceleration framework really highlights some best practices for students and students with disabilities or being served in special ed programs. Some of you may have had the opportunity to engage last year in some of the high leverage practices in special ed sessions that Rachel Browning had offered. The actual link to the whole document is linked in the title of the slide. If you would like a hard copy, I do have a few extra copies in my office, so you can shoot me an email and I will send it over. Or even better, I may come over and drop it off in person because I've missed seeing people in person. So thinking through the lens of that acceleration framework and the high leverage practices that come out of the Council for Exceptional Children, and it's a synthesis of best practices supported by research. And it's really across all content and grade levels. So what are, it identifies some of those best practices. And so thinking through that acceleration framework and inside, outside, and collaboration, we're gonna just look at a few that the acceleration framework calls out the opportunity to do. So thinking through that inside the general ed classroom and thinking through the lens of acceleration versus remediation, making sure we're planning for those scaffolded supports and assistive technology. Those are huge for making sure our students are independent and engaged in grade level content. So thinking through what are the supports and structures we're going to be put in place. So many of our curriculums, like for example, the new high school ELA curriculum has so much of that built into it. So tapping into our TOSA team, our coordinators, as you're planning to make sure we're thinking through that lens. How are we accelerating learning for students with disabilities inside that classroom, and opportunities for that explicit instruction. So the students with disabilities are clear on what's the intended content, what supports and scaffolds am I going to use, and what is that success criteria that supports all students. And we need to make even more explicit and coach our students with disabilities through inside the gen ed classroom. Then I think the next one is going to call out that collaboration piece, which we are intentionally trying to do at a structural level. So you'll see our ESS TOSAs engaging in the new teacher center and teaching partner work alongside your teaching partners and teacher leaders. So we're creating those cohesive ties on how we're supporting students, and then supporting how are we doing that at the building level to plan for those scaffolds and supports that need to happen inside the classroom, and any links to grade level content that we need to do. We know that the best place for students with disabilities is in the gen ed classroom, and IEP teams may need to include that additional time for acceleration outside of that classroom, but we should always be collaborating on what are we targeting for unfinished learning, and we're being systematic and making choices about what we're going to teach in those classes, and then how are we linking that back to the grade level standards. And then that last piece, thinking through that outside the general ed, we know we need to, for some students, provide some of that intensive instruction. Sometimes that can take in place inside the gen ed classroom through a co-taught class, or a class where they're pulling small groups. Sometimes that's outside the classroom, but we always need those cohesive ties and that lens of acceleration, and making sure that we're always bringing students back to those grade level standards, that acceleration, and teaching students to maintain and generalize new learning across time and settings. The ultimate goal is to see them in the gen ed classroom, fully engaged in those grade level standards and having the tools and skills they need in order to be successful in there. So those are the places we looked at for supporting students with disabilities, and I'm going to hand it over to Ashley.
Good afternoon. Yay, I see some smiles. Thanks, Jessica. You're like smack dab on my screen, so just keep smiling the whole time and we'll be good. So I am coming to speak with you about multilingual learners and planning for multilingual learners in mind, considering culture, their language trajectory, and access to grade level content. You saw part of where we have included CLDE supports as part of the acceleration framework, with the understanding that these language supports are important to be embedded and in collaboration with all the other parts of a student's day. Language is essential. So as part of the acceleration framework, we wanted to introduce you all to the new 2020 standards. And so there are 4 big ideas that connect with WIDA 2020, and that includes equity of opportunity and access, integration of content and language, collaboration amongst stakeholders, and functional approach to language development. These 4 components, it's so important that that is included as part of a student's instructional day, and that it's included as part of a student's instructional day every day. And this is work that our team and our department has been engaged in this past year. And we've been able to do a very slow rollout with teacher leaders. Now, some of you might be thinking that, you know, we said before there was nothing new that was coming out. I want to forewarn and just kind of ease and allay any concerns that we are not implementing anything this year. This is strictly about learning. So we are engaged in shared learning alongside our teacher leaders and, again, our department to just dig into these new standards. And what 2020 does is it builds upon the standards that were set up by WIDA in 2004. So it's a build and an expansion upon those. So if you would like to learn more, which I'm hoping that all of you will, we have a session Friday morning from 8 to 9:30 where we're going to dig more into the WIDA 2020 framework. And the next slide, please. So we're going to just zoom in really quickly on the equity portion of the big idea. So I'll give you a moment just to look at those 4 components of the equity big idea from the WIDA 2020 framework. Now, hopefully with this, you are making some connections to what Jessica was sharing about the 6 R's, and you can see that there are connections that we can make all over the place, which is great for our students. But in thinking through the equity big idea within WIDA 2020, we want to identify the linguistic capital or assets. I typically like to use the word capital, but thinking about linguistic capital that students bring to the classroom, thinking about cultural capital and again, those individual and unique experiences that they have, and then that experiential learning that we want to make sure that students are engaged in, and then ensuring that the social emotional supports are embedded throughout that student's day. So these are areas that, again, is just one zoom in to one of those big ideas. And again, this is a slow rollout. So we are not expecting for our teacher leaders to be turnkeying this into the classroom at this moment. This is just for our learning opportunity. But in having this framework, it helps to be able to set the stage for the acceleration that we are wanting to do as a district. And the last slide, please. So as part of acceleration as well, it's also important for us to understand the language trajectory for students. So this is a table that goes through the language trajectory, knowing that language is not always a linear process, that it's very circular and recursive. And so we will have students that will move through the levels in different ways and at different times. But being able to understand the typical language trajectory is important, and using that alongside the other tools that we have. So there's the WIDA performance definitions, understanding what students can do, what they are bringing into the classroom really sets them up for success and for acceleration. So again, Friday morning, we will have a session where we will be going deeper into the WIDA 2020 framework and the work that we will be engaging with TLs in this year. The TLs that we have, and we've doubled our teacher leader pool, which is amazing. So we have a larger group of teacher leaders, but the learning that we do with TLs is really engaged in how they take this work from WIDA and support teachers, support students, support families. So I just want to put a plug that time, that monthly time that we have with teacher leaders is really important for them to take this learning and share it with the larger building. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emily so that she can connect everything together. Thank you.
Thanks. So we know we've covered a lot in this short session between the various teams and the notion of this acceleration framework. We want to bring you back to our commitment and our goal and give you a couple minutes of private reasoning time to think through what connections are you making to this framework as you've looked at it from your own point of view and through the various supports of different groups in our system, and drop that in the chat, please. Thanks, Jessica. Kelsey? I did that on purpose, Jessica, just so you know. It was private reasoning time, was intentional. Like that, Colin, the inclusive mindset. Take about another minute. Thanks, Ryan. Jessica, Lacey. Thank you, everybody. I am gonna turn it over to Shelley now.
Thanks, Emily. So as you start to process some of this information that you're sharing, we are also going to go a little bit deeper into some level content specific information. But first, we want to give you a break and allow you some time to regulate. We know that today has been pretty full for your brains. And so space to file it somewhere and take a break, take a walk, take care of yourself. You will go to your leveled breakout. It is a Google Meet link that is in the agenda. So after you take your break, you will join there, and just know that later in that session, you will have an opportunity to meet with your school team and then in cross-school collaboration groups. And so in your school team, just be thinking about if you need to create your own Meet link or if you're going to meet in person in your building, whatever works best for you. That's not until a little bit later, but you may want to think about that ahead of time. So you will take your break now and join your groups back at 2:35. If you have any questions for us, we are here if you would like to stay on. Otherwise, we will see you at 2:35.
Those leveled, go ahead and attend those leveled breakout sessions that you can find in your agenda. Also know that the agenda links for the 23rd and 26th, those required sessions have all been updated with Performance Matters links and a tracker that you can use and that the LCDs will follow up with you guys about later. So there you go. Hope you're having a good time. Get up, stretch as you click out of this link and click into the other one, and have a great rest of your day. Jenny, anything else? Jenny, I just let them know to go to the other link. So is there anything else you wanted them to know? You might be on mute.
No, sorry, I had to restart.
All right, we'll either see you in a breakout room or bright and early tomorrow morning if we are not in your specific breakout.
Thank you, everyone.